welcome. My name is Piers Ridyard, CEO of RDX Works, a core developer of the Decentralized Finance Protocol, a network entirely focused on bringing DeFi into the mainstream. I am here today with a one-to-one roundtable with Adam Simmons, the CMO of RDX Works, to talk a little bit about the Babylon launch, pre and post, and do a little bit of a retrospective and a forward-looking all at the same time. Adam, welcome, and let's begin. So, first of all, there was obviously some challenges that were faced around Babylon. Babylon itself, huge technical achievement, but there was obviously some things that weren't so good. So could you talk a little bit about the sort of the challenges we saw around user experience and how we're sort of addressing those rough edges going forwards?
Yeah, so of course, the pinnacle of the Babylon campaign is that you could come and start using the Radix network. Now, the plan the entire time is in the lead up to Babylon was getting kind of key opinion leaders to know that something's happening on Radix, understand the broad talking points, and just get general awareness within the crypto enthusiast community, especially those who are interested in L1s and L2 ecosystems, to know something's going on. Now, the day one impression that people get is really important. When they come and try and use the wallet, use the network, use dApps, going live in the ecosystem is going to influence how they want to dive in and when they want to dive in. And we did a lot of stuff great, as you said. So the core migration went perfectly. Things like the transaction manifest are obvious to anyone using them that they are incredibly powerful. Radix Connect, I'm still 95% sure, is some kind of black magic. It works so flawlessly every time I use it. But there were also bits that, in terms of an experience for users, just didn't match up to what you may expect in a current wallet. And that's because the Babylon wallet is a V1. So things like seeing your transaction history, you can see it. You have to go and use the dashboard using Radix Connect, but you don't get it in your wallet. Seeing the US dollar value amount. These are things that don't make or break being able to use DeFi on Radix, but they just feel a little awkward. So Obviously already Russ and the rest of the tech team are putting out so many great updates. So one of our big jobs at the moment is really highlighting a lot of these things getting kicked off and ticked off the list very, very quickly, while also making sure that people are aware of the great stuff going live in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And we've seen some amazing engagement in the ecosystem since it's gone live. We've obviously had Caviar 9 go live. We've had Aussie Swap go live. We have the first version of DeFi Plaza go live. We've now got Weft Finance going live. We've got what was previously Sunday Swap going live. There's lots of like sort of cool things going live. People are playing around with them, giving feedback. I suppose the sort of the early metrics are still sort of very low around engagement with applications and engagement from wallet point of view. But where like that's not the only thing we look at. What else have you seen that's sort of been on the sort of engagement metrics side?
Yeah, so what we track, and my big ethos around every time you grow something like a platform business, is that there isn't a single KPI where you're like, if that goes up, everything's great. So on an e-commerce store, you could be like, well, is our amount of revenue and checkout going up? And you can look at some things that feed into that. With something like Radix, there's a whole holistic view of all the different indicators of success. So we track as many of those as we can. So with the Babylon campaign, for example, we generated about 75 million paid impressions, just under 1 million influencer impressions, 55 press releases, highest ever website traffic, triple-digit percentage growth in the amount of engagement across different social channels, and especially in the developer channels about Radix. Those are all input numbers that as a marketing and dev ecosystem team, we have a lot of control of, basically, because we can have campaigns that drive those input metrics. Now, the output metrics of them can be instant. Some of them can have lag. So a really good example of this is sending a new developer to developers.radixdlt.com. Obviously, that is someone who's going to, when we can track by things like bounce rate, page views, etc., when they come into the developer community, you can kind of follow their pipeline through, but you're not going to be like, hey, we sent a new dev to the Dev Hub on day one, and on day three have a brand new application that's up and running. Although actually one of the crypto challenges that basically did happen, but maybe a bit optimistic. So there's a bit of a lag there. But all of these metrics we hit from the Babylon campaign in terms of input, we're targeting people we wanted to see this. So a lot of our targeting around the different campaigns we were doing wasn't to a broad audience, because Radix and Babylon at day one wasn't ready for those people. The people who are going to come into an early ecosystem are predominantly crypto enthusiasts, so people who actively use crypto regularly. And you can target those really effectively by looking at some of the other competitor influencers, projects, dApps, etc., and targeting people who are interacting with those. You can look at influencers who are talking a lot about ecosystems. And this is something we always learn from. We did a lot of testing leading up to Babylon to be able to accurately target those people. Now, on day one, obviously we weren't hitting the numbers that we would like to see, but on other ways, we're starting to see some of that come through now. So again, very anecdotally, but you see people on Twitter being like, oh, I'm checking out Radix at the moment. Again, it's one or two people, but getting one or two influential people is at this stage really important, because as we will probably talk about later, the later waves or the second, third waves of people coming into an ecosystem look towards those kind of key opinion leaders to see whether there's credibility around a project. And that's the goal of building now. And we're seeing some of that come through with things like TVL increasing since the Babylon launch, with, as you say, some great dApps launching and the user numbers ticking up and up.
Right, and like I think especially with the developer side of things, it's generally sort of a 3 to 6 month lag, at least for a new developer coming in, and with it being an entirely new platform, that lag you have to continuously work on making sure that pipeline is good. And so I think that what we're seeing at the moment of the community engaging with the new dApps that are launching, really important, people giving feedback, people playing around with stuff, even if it's not like completely polished, and helping make sure that in the next phase, as you get to the second wave, you do have a really good ecosystem of applications that required those early adopters, those people who are already in the community, to have engaged with to start off with as well. So one of the things that we've also been running along that side of that is the Runs on Radix campaign, and I'd love to sort of understand a bit more about like how your team's thinking about that strategy and how that is also sort of like geared towards a B2C audience.
So Runs on Radix takes a lot of inspiration from essentially the Intel Inside campaign. And for those of you who don't know, Intel Inside was a 90-0 campaign, and literally in the space of a few years took Intel as a brand that the average consumer was completely unaware of to like 80% plus household awareness of a brand name. And the reason we went with Runs on Radix is that great infrastructure and great platform technology shouldn't be something you really notice as a user, to just get the hell out of your way so you can go and do what you want to do, which is interact with great applications. And if you think of infrastructure platforms in Web 2 and even beyond that, that's really common. Like, when was the last time you loaded up a YouTube video and were like, wow, YouTube's great? However, if YouTube ever buffers, you're like, damn, this is really annoying. You don't tend to think that. Right. You only notice if it's not working in a smooth way. So Runs on Radix is really a way of going, how can you instantly communicate value propositions of the Radix network? So things like user confidence and simplicity and intuitiveness, things like the transaction manifest, safety around Radix Engine, etc., without having to say that every time. Well, that's where the Runs on Radix sticker comes. And this is what basically things like Intel Inside did for Intel. Was at the time, if you saw the Intel Inside sticker or on an ad or something like that through co-marketing, you're like, oh, this has an Intel CPU, and your average consumer was like, that means something to me. They didn't really think immediately of clock rates or whatever. They thought of, oh, this is going to be fast. It's going to be responsive. It's going to have good longevity, etc. And so this is a really effective way to focus messaging, especially with people building on Radix around a single kind of branding piece that we can then amplify in different ways.
Yeah, and I think the all of the advantages that come with Radix, with building something on Radix, it really helps that you can push through. And so when a consumer touches an application and goes, oh my God, that was a great experience, it's associated with the infrastructure that it's running on as well. And I think that in this early phase in which we have many competing infrastructures, it's really important to help emphasize first what the advantages the infrastructure provides, but then by applications associating themselves with that and saying, hey, this runs on Radix, that it's signaling to the consumer, hey, this is something that you've had a good experience with before. You should play with this this one as well, because this one is also relevant for you having a good experience. there's also another campaign you guys have been running, which is We Got That, which seems to be a sort of a really bold move to showcase the Radix USPs. How is that campaign differentiating Radix, and why is that a sort of a good campaign to also be running?
So the We Got That campaign is tackling one of the biggest problems in messaging Radix, which is Radix has so many different components that on their own are entire projects, either in other ecosystems or creating other ecosystems. But because there's so many,
Right.
and the sum of the parts, as the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, that's difficult to communicate. So the analogy I always use here is like Radix is like a ton of marbles dropped on a trampoline. They spread out, and there's a lot of different marbles. Then someone might be like, that's my favorite marble. I really like that thing. And they pick it up and it's like, oh, transaction manifest. Yeah, that's really exciting. Or scripture, that's really exciting. Other projects, and I won't name names, tend to go with a bowling ball approach, which has way less total mass. But if you drop in a trampoline, sinks it down, and anyone who was on it would slide towards it. So you have a central kind of messaging pillar that's really easy to understand. So for some projects in the space, that is just they raised big money. And you go, hey, why do you like that project? Well, they raised $500 million. You're like, okay, makes sense. Or, hey, we're really, really fast. And they don't have anything else, but that allows you to concentrate messaging and narrative. So We Got That as a campaign was really looking at many of these different areas that Radix is just doing it. We've got it as things that other areas are, or other applications, other platforms are building entire multi-year roadmaps of. So things like smart accounts. We've got that. Things like human readable transactions. We've got that. Things like passwordless decentralized logins. We've got that. Radix off-ledger authentication. We've got that. Again, list goes on. And when we actually started putting this together, there was like 60 points. And again, this is less about trying to get people to remember every single individual point, because that's really hard to message. And rather the overall thing, which is everything that's exciting and going on in Web3 at the moment. Yeah, Radix has got that. And that's the point.
Right. And I think it's almost one of those things where you're like, well, that's a good thing. You've got so many good things to talk about, but in other ways, it really does disperse the message, and you need to work out ways in which you can narrow down the message again. And I think that We Got That campaign has been really successful, and a lot of the impressions that you've been talking about sort of came from that We Got That campaign, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so now we're looking forwards. Obviously, this is what sort of led up. What was the lead up to Babylon? Now Babylon is out. Could you sort of talk a little bit more about how we're planning to amplify the success of the projects and users on the Radix ecosystem? Because obviously, once the network is live, it's now the ecosystem success that is of paramount importance.
Exactly. And this is something which we started doing pre-Babylon as well. So a big ethos we've had at Radix for quite a while is celebrating success as being the key. And the reason that is so important is that it's the biggest pull factor, ultimately. Nobody likes to be the first person to clap in a stadium. But if other people have started clapping, you naturally just start joining in. And if you think of this in kind of standard general marketing, that's things like testimonials, seeing other people do it, seeing like word of mouth recommendations, that encourages more and more people to come and get involved. And so in Web3, this is a huge area where we can celebrate a lot of successes. So that can be quantitative, so TVL numbers, user numbers, total number of pools, number of assets, which again, early in an ecosystem, you smash through really quickly. But you also get qualitative, so things that are really interesting developments that don't exist elsewhere, or new features coming within the ecosystem at a very rapid speed. So a good example of this is some of the first DEXs going live on Radix have a lot of features that are included just very, very early on. It's not just simple Uni v2 clones of two-sided simple liquidity. What that means is that we can celebrate all those. And while each individual one might only gather a few people, every time you shout about that is another reason that you get a touch point with the wider crypto community, the wider user base, to go, hey, there's this thing. Do you want to go and have a look? Oh, there's now $2 million of TVL, $5 million of TVL, $10 million of TVL. Oh, there's now this live, that live. And the more you see that, the more the repetition of the brand gets into that crypto enthusiast and crypto activated audiences, the more likely they are to be like, oh, okay, I've heard some stuff about this. I've seen this getting some traction. I've seen nothing bad happen on this, so I'll go and have a look. I'll go and have a play. That's when you capture them. And then you re-engage people who have already been involved when you still see the snowball growing and growing. So that's really the principle behind everything we do with ecosystem success, because people come to platforms for what's built on them, not for the platforms themselves.
Right. And I think that the other sort of thing that is really interesting about platform growth is that there isn't one silver bullet. You have to be hitting many important factors all at the same time, and you have to be growing everything sort of in parallel, so that you don't get a mismatch or an imbalance in your platform in terms of users and things to do. And I think that incrementalism to how you build a campaign around each of those components that then makes sure that the platform itself, when you go there, meets the expectations of the users, and what users that you are targeting at each phase is really important as well.
And you want obviously you want a very slight amount of asymmetry in that growth, but not too much. So again, if you think about this from a simple two-sided marketplace, like something like a ride-sharing app, if you have exactly balanced numbers of users and drivers, like passengers and drivers, great. Like that's a perfectly balanced ecosystem. But there's probably no demand for growth necessarily at that point. Whereas if you have slightly too few drivers for the number of passengers, and you have something like a surcharge, that encourages more drivers to come and take part because there's an opportunity there. If you have slightly too many drivers and the prices drop down, that encourages a few more people to book a ride rather than walking or cycling or something, which may not necessarily be good, but it's more convenient for the platform. So you want that slight imbalance. Whereas if you have a really large imbalance, you can artificially inflate that in the short term, potentially by putting huge incentives in. But then you quickly realize that you've created a bit of a tent pole with no long tail feeding into that. So if you're not interacting with that one big point, all those incentives disappear, suddenly there's nothing to support the rest of the tent and it collapses. So that's a key to how I believe you should grow platforms in a sustainable way.
So talking about that, like what are our plans for increasing user demand for growth, and like how are we making sure that is that's a smooth onboarding process for those new users?
So to take one step back, what was step one we needed on Radix? Step one we needed on Radix was some things for people to do. Not particularly many, but some things. Because while even a perfect wallet experience, a perfect network experience, if all you could go and do was the gumball machine, you're going to get bored pretty quickly. So that's why all of our effort in the lead up to Babylon over the last year or so has been getting those first developers, those first core applications live. Now we're in a point where that supply side outstrips demand currently. There's enough applications there. Now it needs some demand to come in, and there's opportunity for people to come and use these things, which is that asymmetry in a platform that I was talking about. So how do we get that first demand on? Well, initially it's getting some awareness. So that was the first bit of the Babylon campaign. Hey, Radix is doing something. There's something new here. Next is going, hey, where's these opportunities? So what we're seeing at the moment is things like liquidity coming in the LSUL people going around is a great thing. It's getting our rankings up on DeFi Llama, which gets us those kind of first initial eyeballs of really people looking deep within new ecosystems for opportunity. The next phase to that is going, okay, well, if users come in not just to play around a little bit, what do they need? Well, the next big thing is wrapped assets, because you need to have things that people are interested in outside of Radix that they can interact with. So that's already through Instabridge. We've got wrapped BTC, wrapped ETH, wrapped USDC. Those are big asset classes, and you can do things. So the next phase is really, how do we bootstrap up enough liquidity in those that there's kind of a foundational liquidity system to start doing more with? Once you've achieved that bit, and that's actually probably only a small number of users, like historically that is a few power users bring over a lot, and that means that smaller users can interact with those in a completely decentralized way on the network rather than needing to bridge themselves. The next layer to that is going, okay, now you've got enough liquidity in these core assets, how do you start making a market? And again, this becomes an opportunity piece of, hey, if I know that, for example, there's enough market liquidity for XBTC on the Radix ecosystem and the price of BTC moves, well, then I can go and trade against that in the Radix ecosystem for basically an arbitrage profit. That then creates organic pull demand to come and interact, which creates trading fees, which incentivizes more liquidity. But obviously you can't get that demand until you've got enough base liquidity. And that's what our job is basically to keep that slight imbalance in the market by activities. We're amplifying incentives that Radix is providing directly to encourage that initial behavior to spin up the flywheels. Then you get into the third phase. You've got essentially base liquidity in core assets. You've got a kind of functional market for those core assets. Well, now you can start really onboarding more developers and more builders to build off of that, and more users to come and do secondary things. So that's increasing TVL of kind of native altcoins and native assets on Radix. It's things like NFT markets, it's things like lending markets. Now there's liquidity to liquidate, etc., etc. And those are kind of the next few phases that we've really got to hit. And those are the outcomes that everything we do are required to hit. And what I find so exciting about this phase of a new ecosystem is those aren't really timeline driven mainly for me. They can happen super fast. And anyone who has been around in previous like crypto cycles, in hindsight, you're like, oh, I saw that starting to build. But then it happens really suddenly. And that is, again, what we saw in DeFi Summer and what we see in new ecosystems. And that is what we're trying to engineer, is how do you get out of the way of those flywheels once they start spinning up?
And I suppose the a lot of that comes down to sort of TVL in DeFi ecosystems. So like, what is our short-term and long-term targets, and how do we plan to achieve them in terms of TVL?
Yeah, so phase one, which is the bit which I'm most clear on at the moment, is that we need to get into roughly around the top 50 of DeFi Llama in terms of TVL, which is around the 25 million mark. Now, the reason for that kind of goalpost is if that's made up of both native Radix assets, things like LSULP, but also kind of core assets, you then have enough liquidity to start trading around. If you're someone looking on DeFi Llama for new emerging ecosystems, that's the point you can go, okay, there's enough liquidity there that there's stuff I can do and make a meaningful profit on activity that I'm doing within the ecosystem. The next phase after that is where you start kind of punching up into like the top 25. And really to do that, that's where you need good markets and good depth within both wrapped assets, but also start bringing in native assets. That's where you need these applications that are driving a lot of user demand. And that's really kind of the phase 2, phase 3 stage.
Interesting. And I suppose part of that also comes into partnerships and exchanges. So like, how are we, what is our approach to partnerships and additional exchanges post Babylon, and what are the factors we can control there, and what are the factors that are outside of our control?
So talking quite generally around just any kind of partner and exchange, there's things that we control, which is what is the barrier to entry? That's the biggest one. Like, how hard is it to integrate Radix? So pre-Babylon, one of the things we heard quite often was, well, Babylon's coming, I'm going to have to completely redo everything. Or in the stage of some partners is like, oh, well, my business or my project only makes sense on Radix if we've got this thing. So like oracles are often something that's a blocker. Bridges is something that's often a blocker, or having dexes where you can liquidate collateral is a blocker. So these things that we can work to decrease. And we have done a great job, obviously, with Babylon coming out, but we can keep making that easier and easier for partners and exchanges to integrate with. The other side, which I think is more paramount now, is showing demand and desire to integrate or list or do anything with Radix. And realistically, that's from growth. And that is something that we have some control over. We can do campaigns, activities to increase the metrics of how well Radix is performing in the market. But ultimately, we can't force a partner or an exchange to be like, oh, that's exciting enough for me. But if you flip it on the other side of the argument, if you were a partner looking at Radix or an exchange looking at Radix, ultimately you're going, will I retain users that I've already got that I could lose to someone else? Will I gain new users that I don't already have access to? Will I directly monetize this? So in the case of exchanges, is there like enough trading volume that I think I'm going to get enough fees from that? But also, am I going to influence my brand by listing Radix positively or negatively? And so some of that is being an innovator versus some of that is being too early. Now, our job is to really sell that story into those partners and exchanges all of the time. And it is a hard job. Ultimately, we're in a competitive market. We're not something easy to integrate with, like an ERC20 token. And there's lots of pieces in play. But basically, from our side, anything that we can control in terms of getting these done, we are going to do. And we are doing continually. But there are things, unfortunately, that are outside our controls around like regulation, individual entities, commercial appetite at the current time, that we can't force them. And all we can do is keep working on the things that make Radix more desirable and easier to integrate with to maximize those partnerships and listings.
Right, and now we have a bunch of tools that we didn't have before, which is that we have an ecosystem, and we have users, and we have TVL, and we have like activity, and we have things that are going on. So like, if you're a community member and you're looking at this and going, man, I really want to be on Kraken, I really want to be on Coinbase, I really want to be on Binance. Honestly, the best thing you can do is go and get involved in the ecosystem and go and help out the applications and help things get better. Put some of your tokens to work. Actually get involved, and because that like, if you're not going to use it, then no one is, right? Like the if you're here supporting the Radix ecosystem and the things building, then you're the ones who are going to be most likely to be like, yeah, it's a bit janky, as in like this new application that's just launched, but I can see the potential and I'm getting really excited about that and I'm getting involved. And that's what the early phases of all of these platforms look like. They're all a bit janky, but they get better by how much engagement you're getting from your user base, and how and being able to respond to that, and how people are using it, and what people are finding out that they want to have better or different. And so this is I think the most exciting phase to be part of a new ecosystem, which is where you go and get to play with everything, and you get to see it grow from like baby little things to sort of things that start actually competing with the big boys in very short spaces of time. So like, go get involved because it massively helps everything that we're doing in the back end to sort of go and talk to these exchanges.
And I think one thing that's also really important to make clear to especially the kind of core community around this is like, we pursue all angles when we're talking with like partners. It's like, I mean, Piers, you go to many networking events, have calls, get introductions from various people, work with agencies, work with connectors, work directly through kind of main channels. All of those are hunted down. And in the vast majority of cases, it is not a case of the market being in a place where it's, hey, just give us a chunk of money and we'll do it. Like, especially for all of the partners and integrations that the community wants, that isn't the blocking factor. The blocking factor is, does this make sense for these partners and these exchanges in the mid and long term to support the Radix network? And the biggest thing to drive that is the ecosystem activity.
Yeah. Once you get to a certain tier of people, it becomes much less about the immediate value that you can bring in terms of payment, and much more about the long-term value that they recognize in it. So like, a good example of this would be someone like Fireblocks, who you literally can't pay Fireblocks to prioritize where you are. It's entirely based on whether or not they see enough long-term value for their key customers ongoing to go, right, we're going to prioritize this chain, or we're going to do that chain. And so those kind of relationships take a very, very long time, but they are constantly looking at who cares about this ecosystem. And so you have these, like, you have multiple bits of dependencies, right? But it all comes back to, ultimately, does the ecosystem itself look healthy? And if the ecosystem itself looks healthy, everything else becomes a lot easier, because you have a case that you can essentially put in front of these partners and say, look, you're going to miss out on a huge amount of business. Your competitors are going to come in and they're going to be able to take this business from you. If you don't get in first, people are going to sort of move away from your platform because you're not supporting this thing. Like, all of those things become much easier conversations than if you have sort of nothing going on. And we don't, and we have lots of things going on in early phases. So again, get in there, get involved, start using. I think the last question I have for you, Adam, is what indicators are you using to demonstrate the demand for Radix to our partners and exchanges, and how does that tie into our overall growth strategy?
Yeah, so number one for ecosystem, for better or worse, it tends to be TVL is the foot in the door one. Right. It is a simple metric that you can compare like for like, and everyone knows there's problems with it, but it's kind of the headline. The next piece is volume of transactions on the network, and that's measured in different ways. So some people are like number of transactions, some people are fees burnt, etc., depending on whether they're looking for complex things or not. Market depth and market activity, the number of dApps that are live on Radix and are being utilized, the breadth of those dApps, the concentration of where that liquidity is, and then sentiment. And sentiment is ultimately around hype. And the way I describe this is kind of the third metric of things the partners and exchanges look at, which is not just what is the benefit of integrating or working with Radix today, but where's that going to position us in 3 months, in 6 months? And if you can meet that point of going, hey, there's a lot of potential here, and I think in 3 months this is going to look really good, you as an external brand looking to integrate are in a really strong position at that point, because you can go, hey, to your users, they might be like, oh, why are you listing this Radix thing? This is only really, really new. Why are you putting that live now? But in 3 months' time, you can go, hey, remember that Radix thing we listed? That's huge. And then they look like a really great place to be, because there's early opportunities there. And you see that the same with press and influencers and everything else. But ultimately, it's a holistic picture. And it comes back to that same thing of growing a platform, that it's not one metric. And actually, if the platform's too imbalanced anyway, it tends to put people's backs up a bit, because it just feels a bit wrong. So again, as you said, Piers, best thing people can do, especially assuming a lot of the core Radix community is watching, things like use your LP or LSU tokens. That's really effective. Bridge over assets, use applications, do transactions, give feedback. Talk about this within the community, at least, of what you've been up to, what you've been trying. Little things. So again, it's one of my favorite examples recently. Someone used the transaction manifest completely organically to do a 13 or 16 XRD ARB profit early on. And it was, again, no one is going to care about 16 XRD as an ARB profit. But it was the fact that this person with no coding experience, without needing a smart contract, actually said, this is what I did. They worked out in real time. They then put it up on Twitter. We can amplify that. And people go, holy shit, they did that without a smart contract, with just a tiny amount of TVL on the network a week or so after it went live. Oh, this is interesting. I should get someone smart on my team, or someone smart that I trust as a key opinion leader, to tell me about this. And that's how a lot of these partners and exchanges make decisions, is whether they get that feedback from the smart money, or the influencers in the space, true influencers in the space, going, yeah, Radix is onto something really cool. And that is all proven by amplifying ecosystem successes across the board of what the users and developers are able to do here.
Cool. So I think the sort of the TLDR of this whole interview is everything that the community and the ecosystem can do amplifies everything that we can do in terms of marketing, in terms of PR, in terms of metrics, in terms of partnerships, all of that kind of stuff. And we're all working together on that. So like, we are doing lots of things in the background, and the more that the community can engage in the foreground on that, it all helps, it all builds. Adam, thank you so much for your time. It's been really enjoyable doing a one-to-one, and looking forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.